Before the philosophy, there was the vibration. The end of the Golden Age arrived as a frequency. Deep within the magma chamber beneath the central island, the pressure reached the critical threshold of the caprock. This geological stress transmitted through the limestone foundation of the city, manifesting as a harmonic tremor. It began as a hum, a low-frequency resonance that set the teeth of the priesthood on edge. In the high citadel, the silver bowls filled with wine began to sing. The surface of the harbor water turned white, frothing as dissolved carbon dioxide hissed up from the deep vents. The silence that followed carried a weight heavier than the noise. The seagulls that swarmed the merchant docks ceased their crying. The wind died. The air pressure dropped so precipitously that the ears of the dock workers popped and the capillaries in their noses burst. Then the mountain spoke. It hit the atmosphere with the force of a kinetic weapon. The sound wave traveled at supersonic speeds, a physical wall of compressed air that flattened the olive groves on the outer rings before the fire even touched them. A column of tephra, pulverized rock, glass, and crystal punched through the troposphere, rising 30 kilometers into the stratosphere in seconds. It froze there, spreading out into the shape of a colossal pine tree, casting a shadow that swallowed the Aegean Sea. The sun turned a bruised purple, then vanished. The city of the concentric rings, the masterpiece of the ancient world, disappeared into the dark. The day ended at noon. The only light came from the dirty thunderstorm, the jagged arcs of red and violet lightning generated by the friction of the falling ash. The civilization died in the dark. The ash fell with the weight of wet cement. It buried the libraries of the law. It filled the canals. It crushed the roofs of the temples, where the kings had poured the blood of the bull. The geography itself was erased. The island collapsed into the empty magma chamber, dragging the metropolis down into the boiling sea. For 3,000 years, the only record of this apocalypse was the mud. The history of the world paused, reset, and began again. The name of the city was forgotten. The location was lost. It ceased to be a place and became a ghost story, waiting for a traveler to find the corpse. The silence lasted for 8,000 years. The story of the lost continent sat locked in stone, waiting for a translator. Then, in the year 590 BC, a traveler arrived in the Nile Delta to break the seal. Solon, the Archon of Athens, came to Egypt seeking wisdom. He arrived as a political refugee in all but name. He had just rewritten the laws of his home city, creating a democracy from chaos, and then fled the country to avoid the temptation of becoming a tyrant. He traveled south, across the Great Green Sea, seeking perspective. He found humiliation. He arrived in Sais, the royal capital of the 26th dynasty. To a Greek of the 6th century, Athens stood as a rising star, a city of wood, ambition, and new ideas. But Sais operated on a different scale of time. It was a metropolis of the dead. It measured its history not in centuries, but in millennia. The temples here were already ancient when the Greeks were still painting themselves with blue clay and living in huts. Solon walked through the gates of the Temple of Neith, the spider goddess who wove the fabric of existence. The scale of the architecture crushed him. The hypostyle hall was a forest of stone, the columns so thick that 5 men could not link hands around them. The air inside stagnated, heavy with the scent of Chi-Fi incense, mastich, pine, and juniper, burned continuously for 3,000 years. Here, he met the guardians of the archive. The Greeks called him Sonches, the Satite. He was a high priest of the inner sanctum, a man whose skin mimicked the texture of the dry papyrus he guarded. Solon attempted to engage his host with a display of Hellenic wisdom. He began to recite the genealogy of the Greek heroes. He spoke of Phoroneus, the first man, and of Niobe. He recounted the great flood of Deucalion, the event the Greeks believed constituted the singular end of the world. He tried to calculate the years, tracing the lineage back 20 generations. Sonchis did not interrupt him. He waited until Solon ran out of names. Then the old priest laughed. It was a dry, rattling sound, echoing off the limestone walls. He looked down at the famous lawgiver with the pity of a grandfather watching a toddler stack blocks. "Oh, Solon," the priest said, "you Hellenes are never anything but children. There is not an old man among you." The insult struck the Athenian like a slap, but Sonchis raised a hand to silence his protest. The priest targeted the memory of the Greeks, rather than their years. He explained the mechanism of oblivion. "The earth," Sonchis said, "functions as a violent machine. It rejects the straight line of progress. It moves in a circle of destruction. There have been many destructions of mankind, and there will be many more. The agents vary. Sometimes the gods use fire, scorching the earth with the heat of the sun, a phenomenon the Greeks mythologized as the story of Phaeton, but which Sonchis identified as a deviation of the heavenly bodies. Sometimes they use water, turning the dry land into mud. When the fires come, the shepherds on the mountains survive, but the cities in the valleys burn. When the floods come, the herdsmen are safe, but the writers, the architects, and the kings are swept into the sea. And so," Sonchis said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "you have to begin all over again like children and know nothing of what happened in ancient times." The priest gestured to the walls of the temple. They were covered in registers of hieroglyphs, carved deep enough to survive a fire, placed high enough to survive a flood. "But here," he said, "the water flows gently from below. We are safe. And so, we remember what you have forgotten." The story of Atlantis began as a translation exercise. Solon faced a formidable barrier. He stood before the pillars of Neith, columns of black granite that Sonchis claimed held the history of the world before the deluge. But the script remained impenetrable. The Egyptians recorded their archives in Medu Neter, the words of the gods. These symbols functioned as a complex, jewel-layered system. A glyph of a vulture might represent the bird itself, the sound of a glottal stop, or the abstract concept of motherhood. Sonchis acted as the bridge. The old priest traced the lines of the inscription with a fingernail, reading aloud in the spoken demotic of the era. Solon listened, processed the concepts through his own cultural filter, and scratched the notes into his wax tablet in the Attic dialect of Athens. This process required a specific intellectual tool known to later historians as interpretatio Graeca. Solon needed to map foreign Egyptian concepts onto familiar Greek archetypes to make them intelligible to his audience. This creates the primary linguistic distortion in the text. When Sonchis read the passage concerning the first king of the lost continent, he pointed to a glyph representing Shu, the Egyptian primordial god of air, who kneels to hold up the celestial vault. Solon recognized the iconography. He accessed the Greek equivalent, the Titan who bears the weight of the heavens on his shoulders. He scratched the name Atlas into the wax. The same logic applied to the geography. The priest spoke of the great green ocean to the west, where the sun dies. Solon translated this as Atlantikos, the Sea of Atlas. This explains the discrepancy that has plagued skeptics for centuries. Atlantis was never the indigenous name of the city. It was a Greek localization of an Egyptian title. Night after night, Solon worked to visualize the data. He realized the columns described something far more complex than a religious myth. They described a machine. He dipped his reed brush in ink and began to draw the schematic described by the priest. The result was a bullseye geometry: 3 rings of water and 2 rings of land, enclosing a central island. As Solon sketched the dimensions, the engineering logic emerged. This layout functioned as a massive, fortified harbor complex. The text detailed the width of the canals in stadia. It described the bridges, built wide enough to allow a trireme to pass underneath, yet narrow enough to be defended by a single squad of hoplites. It described the covered docks hollowed out of the red and black stone cliffs, protecting the fleet from the Atlantic storms. The precision of the report stunned him. The Egyptian archives included inventory lists, the tonnage of timber imported, the specific alloys used to plate the walls, and the strategic deployment of the 10 client kingdoms. The columns described a great power that marched out of the Atlantic Ocean 9,000 years prior, conquering the Mediterranean as far as Tyrrhenia and the borders of Egypt. Solon recognized the implications. If this chronicle held true, then the history of Greece required a total rewrite. The Greeks believed they were the first civilization to rise from the mud, but the columns claimed that a primordial Athens had existed 9,000 years ago, a warrior state that possessed the discipline to stand alone against the Atlantic Empire. He prepared to bring this knowledge home. He envisioned an epic poem, a magnum opus that would rival the works of Homer. He would give the Greeks back their lost history. He rolled the papyrus, sealed it with wax, and boarded the ship for Athens. But the poem remained in the inkwell. Solon returned to an Athens consuming itself. The political chaos he had tried to prevent had erupted. The tyrant, Pisistratus, seized power, and in the struggle to preserve the democracy, the story of the lost continent became a luxury Solon could no longer afford. The Atlantis epic died in the draft stage. The manuscript survived. It went underground. Solon handed the notes to his relative, Dropides. Dropides passed them to his son, Critias the Elder. For 200 years, the story of the burnt island sat in the dark of a family library, a bedtime story told to children. It waited for the one man who could turn the notes into philosophy. It waited for Plato. The core of Solon's translation was a blueprint. The text describes a city designed with the rigorous precision of a clock mechanism. The capital did not grow organically like Athens or Rome, sprawling outward from a central market. It was terraformed. The builders took a small central mountain and engineered a barrier system around it, creating a bullseye of concentric circles. The dimensions provided by Plato are specific enough to reconstruct the city in a CAD program. The central island, the citadel of the kings, measured 5 stadia in diameter, roughly 900 meters. Surrounding this nucleus were 3 rings of water and 2 rings of land, expanding outward in a mathematical ratio. The engineering challenge was connectivity. To link the rings, the Atlanteans bored a massive canal, 300 feet wide and 100 feet deep, from the open ocean directly to the center. This transformed the inner rings into a deep water port. But the true marvel was the verticality. They engineered a complex intersection, bridges for the populace, tunnels for the fleet. The text describes bridges wide enough for a trireme to sail underneath, while traffic flowed overhead. This layout served a military purpose. The concentric rings acted as a layered defense system, making the central citadel virtually impregnable to naval assault. But in times of peace, the rings functioned as the world's most sophisticated parking garage. Plato explicitly describes hollowed-out docks. The Atlanteans quarried into the vertical cliffs of the land rings, creating subterranean ship sheds. They housed the fleet in covered bunkers, protected from the rot of the sun. The density of the fleet implies a command economy. The text states that the inner rings were reserved for the Royal Navy, keeping the weapons of war separate from the merchant chaos of the outer harbor. This segregation suggests a society that rigidly categorized space, balancing commerce with paranoia. The gates themselves told a story of resource distribution. The outermost wall was coated in brass. The middle wall was plated with tin. But the wall of the central citadel flashed with the red fire of orichalcum. This graduation of metals, from common alloy to precious rarity, mimicked the social hierarchy. As one moved deeper into the bull's eye, the architecture shifted from functional stone to radiant metal. The geometry of the city was a physical map of the class system: the people on the outside, the fleet in the middle, and the gods in the center. The architecture of Atlantis relied on a specific geological anomaly. Most ancient cities were monochromatic. Athens was a city of violet-crowned hills and white pentelic marble. The Egyptian capitals were cities of beige limestone and pink granite. But Atlantis was a city of stripes. Solon's translation contains a geological detail so specific that it acts as a fingerprint for the entire myth. He states that they rejected imports from distant mountains, digging the stone directly from the ground. The island sat upon a deposit of multicolored volcanic rock. The text lists 3 specific colors: white, black, and red. This triad provides a clue to the island's violent origins. The white suggests pumice or limestone, the skeletal remains of ancient seabeds or ash falls. The black indicates basalt, the hardened blood of previous eruptions. The red points to oxidized scoria or iron-rich tuff, rock that has rusted in the open air. By mixing these stones, the Atlanteans created a city that mimicked the chaotic beauty of the earth itself. The extraction process demonstrated their efficiency. Plato explains that the quarrying served a dual purpose. As the masons cut the massive blocks of red and black stone from the cliffs of the inner rings, they harvested material and sculpted space simultaneously. The hollows left behind by the removal of the rock were not abandoned as scars on the landscape. They were smoothed, deepened, and flooded. The quarry became the harbor. The negative space where the rock had been became the roofed dry docks mentioned in the previous chapter. Every block added to the height of a wall subtracted from the depth of a canal. The city grew upward and downward simultaneously. The result was an aesthetic that the Greeks found jarring, perhaps even barbaric, in its opulence. Solon describes the walls of the city as variegated. The architects rejected the clean abstraction of whitewash. They celebrated the raw texture of the planet. They wove the red, black, and white stones together in patterns, creating a checkerboard effect that rippled across the facades of the temples and the gymnasiums. These visual choices signaled a cultural divergence. To a Greek philosopher like Plato, the ideal form was abstract, white, and pure. But Atlantis represented a culture in love with the material world, with sensory input, with color, and with the heavy, physical reality of the earth. The city was not an intellectual exercise. It was a celebration of natural resources. The palette of the earth extended to the interior design. The text mentions that the baths were constructed to utilize the natural thermal springs found on the island, some cold, some boiling hot. This implies a volcanic plumbing system. The Atlanteans tapped into the geothermal veins of their island, channeling the heat of the magma chamber to warm the waters of the royal baths. The integration of the city with its geology was total. They drank the water that flowed from the earth. They bathed in the heat that rose from the depths, and they built their homes from the bedrock of the island. But this reliance on the specific geology of the island creates a forensic paradox. Volcanic islands, composed of red tuffs and black basalts, are geologically unstable. The very stones that gave the city its unique beauty were evidence of the forces that would eventually destroy it. By building their paradise on a foundation of fire and ash, the Atlanteans were constructing their capital on the lid of a pressure cooker. The wealth of the city was literal. It was not paper money or credit. It was the physical mineral content of the land they occupied. And the greatest of these minerals, the one that defined their power, was the mysterious red metal that flashed from the center of the citadel. The true psychological impact of Atlantis lay in its metallurgy. Solon's translation details a defense system designed to blind the enemy as much as repel them. The city employed a color code of strategic metals to distinguish its zones of power. The outermost wall, encompassing the merchant districts, was clad in bronze. It shimmered with a dull, utilitarian yellow light, the color of commerce and common weaponry. The second wall, guarding the inner harbor, marked a drastic escalation in value. Plato states it was coated in tin. In the Bronze Age, tin acted as the strategic equivalent of enriched uranium. It was the rare, essential ingredient required to harden copper into weapons. To coat a defensive fortification in pure, refined tin was a geopolitical statement. It signaled that Atlantis controlled the trade routes so completely that they could afford to use a strategic resource as wallpaper. But the citadel itself, the Acropolis of the Kings, followed a different rule. It flashed with the red fire of orichalcum. This substance remains the most controversial element of the text. The Greek word orichalkos translates literally as mountain copper. For centuries, scholars dismissed it as a mythical invention, a fantasy metal like J.R.R. Tolkien's mithril. However, numismatics and metallurgy provide a grounding for the myth. The Romans later used the term to describe brass, a copper-zinc alloy. But Plato clearly distinguishes it as something rarer, second only to gold in value. The description matches a natural alloy known as tumbaga, a mixture of gold and copper often found in the Andes, but also present in the ancient Mediterranean. When polished, this alloy does not shine yellow. It glows with a deep, incandescent crimson. The text specifies that the Atlanteans mined this metal directly from the center of the island. This detail reinforces the volcanic hypothesis. Volcanic vents often act as elevators for heavy metals, bringing gold, copper, and rare earth elements from the mantle to the surface. The fire of the walls mirrored the fire of the mountain. The application of these metals culminated in the Temple of Poseidon. Solon describes an interior that defies modern architectural sensibilities. It was a cavern of precious reflections. The ceiling was a mosaic of ivory, elephant tusks imported from the continent, inlaid with silver, gold, and orichalcum. The pillars were solid metal. The floor was a tessellation of the three stone colors. This description serves a dual function in the narrative. First, it establishes the factual existence of a vast trade network. Ivory does not exist on Mediterranean islands. It must be imported from Africa. Second, it establishes the moral decay. In the Greek worldview, such excess signaled hubris. A city that walls itself in gold and walks on silver has lost its connection to the natural order. They were converting the earth into luxury, a process that usually precedes a correction from the gods. The wealth of the temple protected the city's most sacred object, a column of orichalcum that held the laws of the kings and the site of the bloodiest ritual in the ancient world. The center of the bull's eye held the seat of the empire's theology. The Temple of Poseidon dominated the skyline of the citadel. Solon's measurements present a structure that defies the standard proportions of the ancient world. He records the length at one stadium, roughly 600 feet, and the width at 300 feet. This data point is significant. It describes a building nearly 3 times the volume of the Parthenon. The aesthetic of the building matched its scale. While the Greeks preferred the naked purity of marble, the Atlanteans clad their holy sites in metal. The exterior walls were coated entirely in silver, ensuring the temple shone like a second moon against the dark volcanic rock of the island. The pinnacles alone were gold, acting as lightning rods for the sun. Inside this silver box stood the primary idol of the state religion. The statue of Poseidon was so large that his head touched the roof beams. But the forensic value of this statue lies in the vehicle he drove. Plato describes the god standing in a chariot, driving 6 winged horses. This image creates a fracture in the timeline. If one accepts the Egyptian date of 9600 BC, this statue constitutes a technological impossibility. The horse-drawn war chariot is a complex invention of the Middle Bronze Age, appearing no earlier than 2000 BC on the Eurasian steppe. Its presence in the Holy of Holies serves as a temporal anchor. It drags the reality of Atlantis forward from the Paleolithic Ice Age and locks it firmly into the era of the Great Palaces. This technology identifies the Atlanteans as advanced engineers who mastered the wheel, the axle, and the breeding of draft animals. Surrounding the chariot, the text describes 100 nereids riding dolphins. This number offers a subtle theological clue. In standard Greek mythology, the nereids, sea nymphs, number only 50. The doubling of the number in the Atlantean canon suggests a divergent religious tradition, a great schism, where the island culture amplified the retinue of the sea god beyond the limits known to the mainland. In the shadow of the golden giant stood the mechanism of government. A pillar of solid orichalcum rose from the center of the temple floor. This was the constitution of Atlantis. The architects rejected perishable papyrus. They inscribed the laws into the metal itself. The political structure relied on a federation of 10 kings, each ruling a subdivision of the empire. They maintained a strict schedule of assembly. Every 5th year, and then alternately every 6th year, the kings gathered at this pillar to deliberate. This alternating cycle of 5 and 6 years reveals a preoccupation with cosmic accuracy. It allowed the Atlanteans to synchronize their lunar calendars with the solar year, ensuring that their rituals remained locked to the seasons. They valued mathematical harmony over convenient integers. But the pillar served a darker purpose than just legislation. It was the focal point of the state ritual. The laws inscribed on the metal ended with a curse, a binding oath that demanded blood for any violation. And to renew that oath, the kings had to hunt. The political unity of Atlantis required a periodic act of controlled violence. Every 5 or 6 years, the 10 kings left their provinces and gathered in the central sanctuary. Before they could deliberate on policy or trade, they had to prove their right to rule. They did this through the hunt without iron. Solon's text provides a specific rule of engagement that forensic anthropologists recognize as a ritual fossil. Although Atlantis was a superpower possessing bronze swords, copper-tipped spears, and iron tools, all metal was banned from the sanctuary floor. The kings entered the ring naked of technology. They carried only wooden staves and hemp nooses. They were released into the temple grounds with free-roaming bulls. These were wild aurochs, animals of massive muscle density and aggression. The ritual demanded that the 10 men work as a coordinated pack. They had to corner a beast, subdue it with blunt force, and capture it alive using only ropes. This protocol served a clear evolutionary function. It stripped away the advantages of hereditary wealth and armor. It forced the rulers to demonstrate raw physical courage and the ability to cooperate under the threat of immediate death. If the kings could not coordinate to subdue the bull, they could not coordinate to rule the empire. Once the beast was secured, the ritual shifted from a hunt to a legal proceeding. The kings dragged the exhaustion-drugged animal to the center of the temple, to the pillar of orichalcum. The geometry of the sacrifice was precise. The column contained the inscriptions of the laws and the curses. At the top of the pillar, a mechanism or ledge allowed the kings to hoist the animal into a specific position. They struck the bull. They cut the throat directly over the pillar. The choreography ensured that the hot arterial blood cascaded down the metal face of the column. It flowed over the carved letters, filling the indentations of the laws with red liquid. This action symbolized the vivification of the state. The blood of the bull, the symbol of chaotic power, was absorbed by the law, the symbol of order. The text became living tissue. The ceremony concluded with a communal ingestion of the sacrifice. The kings collected the blood in a golden crater and mixed it with wine. To seal the oath, they performed a specific act of contamination. They took a clot of the gore, a solid piece of the sacrifice, and dropped it into each of their cups. They poured a libation onto the fire, swearing to judge according to the laws inscribed on the pillar and to punish any sovereign who betrayed the federation. Then they drank. This was the moment of binding. By consuming the blood that had washed the laws, they internalized the constitution. They became the living avatars of the pillar. But as night fell, the ritual moved from the physical to the judicial. The hunt was over. The judgment was about to begin. As night fell over the Atlantic, the ritual moved from the physical to the judicial. The kings cleansed themselves of the blood and changed their vestments. Plato specifies a wardrobe of most beautiful azure. They donned heavy robes dyed the dark blue of the deep ocean, signaling a shift in persona. They were no longer hunters, they were now judges. The setting for their deliberation was strictly prescribed. They sat on the ground, directly in the cooling ashes of the sacrifice. This posture served a forensic purpose. It grounded the judgment in the physical evidence of the oath. By sitting in the dust of the offering, they physically connected themselves to the curse inscribed on the pillar. In this darkness, lit only by the dying embers of the bullfire, the Federation adjudicated the crimes of the empire. They reviewed the trade disputes between the 10 provinces, the violations of the maritime law, and the accusations of treason. The verdicts rendered in the ashes were designed to outlast the judges who issued them. The Atlantean legal system rejected oral tradition. Every judgment required a permanent record. The kings inscribed their decisions onto tablets of thin gold. Once the session concluded, they performed a final act of archiving. They wrapped the golden tablets in their azure robes and dedicated them to the temple sanctuary. This detail reveals a civilization obsessed with legacy. They were creating a library of justice, a golden archive of case law stored in the Holy of Holies. But this strict adherence to the law eventually began to rot. Plato shifts the narrative from the what of the ritual to the why of the fall. He does not attribute the decline of Atlantis to a sudden evil, but to a slow, biological dilution. He introduces the concept of the Thea Moira, the divine portion. For many generations, the kings obeyed the laws written on the orichalcum. They possessed a gentleness joined with wisdom. They despised everything but virtue, caring little for their gold and silver, viewing their massive wealth as a burden rather than a prize. But the mechanism of inheritance is entropy. Plato explains that the god portion in their blood, the genetic legacy of Poseidon, began to fade. It was mixed again and again with mortal stock. The divine signal-to-noise ratio decreased. The human nature gained the upper hand. The precise mathematical order of the city began to unravel. The kings became unable to bear their fortune. To the eyes of the common man, they still appeared glorious and blessed, shining in their tin and copper walls. But to the eyes of the wise, they were already rotting. They had lost the fairest of their precious gifts, the ability to govern themselves. Drunk on power and unmoored from the restraint of the Theomoira, the empire turned its gaze outward. The ritual hunt of the bull failed to satisfy their aggression. They began to hunt the world. The decay of the ritual law triggered a shift in foreign policy. The divine portion vanished, replaced by a hunger for material acquisition. Solon's translation shifts genre here. It abandons the architectural marvels and the utopian geometry to describe a war of annihilation. The Atlantean Federation, previously content with its island paradise and its trade monopoly, mobilized for total conquest. The text clearly delineates the line of control. The empire projected power eastward from the Atlantic. On the southern coast of the Mediterranean, they conquered Libya, holding the territory all the way to the border of Egypt. On the northern coast, they occupied Europe as far as Tyrrhenia, the land of the Etruscans in modern Italy. This geography is significant. It implies that the Atlanteans had successfully turned the western Mediterranean into an internal lake. They controlled the grain of North Africa and the mineral wealth of Italy. Now, they looked east toward the only remaining rivals, the city-states of the Aegean and the Old Kingdom of the Nile. The invasion strategy relied on overwhelming force. Plato uses the phrase, "at one blow." This terminology suggests a coordinated, amphibious shock and awe campaign rather than a slow encroachment. The Atlanteans rejected negotiation. They sought to impose the yoke of slavery. The logistics of such an invasion in the Bronze Age, or the Neolithic, if one accepts the 9600 BC date, would be staggering. It required a supply chain capable of feeding hundreds of thousands of rowers and marines across thousands of miles of open water. The ship sheds of the capital emptied. The merchant vessels, once used for the tin trade, were retrofitted for troop transport. The description mirrors the terror recorded in later Egyptian inscriptions regarding the Sea Peoples. It depicts a confederation of tribes moving like a locust swarm, burning cities to the ground and erasing the cultural memory of the conquered. The silence that Solon spoke of in the beginning, the historical amnesia, served as the deliberate policy of the invader. The World War had begun. The text describes a state of emergency that paralyzed the ancient world. The smaller kings and potentates capitulated, choosing tribute over destruction. They opened their gates and handed over their sons as hostages. The momentum seemed irreversible. The Atlantean war machine possessed the resources of a continent, the discipline of the hunt without iron, and the technological edge of the bronze and tin monopoly. They advanced on the final stronghold of independence. They sailed for Athens. But here, the narrative pivots. The massive golden empire of the West was about to break its teeth on the granite austerity of the East. Understanding the victory requires reconstructing the victor. The Athens described in the Atlantis texts is not the classical city of marble poets and philosophers. It is a fortress state. Plato, through the voice of Critias, provides a geological profile of the region that modern geographers recognize as accurate for the prehistoric era. He describes Attica before the Great Erosion. He states that the land was once fat and soft, covered in deep, fertile soil that supported vast forests. But over the millennia, the floods and the deforestation stripped the flesh from the earth, leaving only the skeleton of a body wasted by disease, the bare limestone bones that define the Greek landscape today. On this fertile prehistoric rock, the Proto-Athenians lived as a warrior commune. They rejected the luxury of the Atlanteans. They possessed no private property, no gold, and no silver. The guardians lived together in the barracks of the Acropolis, eating at common mess halls, training solely for the defense of the state. This creates the central thematic conflict of the myth. It is not just a war between two armies. It is a war between two ideologies. On one side, the Atlantean Empire, a complex, wealthy, technologically superior naval power corrupted by greed. On the other, Proto-Athens, a landlocked, austere, agrarian society defined by discipline. It is the eternal conflict between the merchant and the monk, the pirate and the soldier. The war arrived in the Aegean. The coalition of free states collapsed almost immediately. Solon's text details the disintegration of the resistance. As the Atlantean fleet swept into the eastern basin, the allies of Athens deserted. Some surrendered out of terror, others were cut off by the speed of the Atlantean advance. The text explicitly states that Athens was reduced to the necessity of standing alone. The battle that followed occurred in extreme danger. The narrative implies a siege of the city itself. The Atlantean marines, accustomed to the easy conquests of the barbarians in the west, finally encountered a peer competitor in the art of violence. The Athenians possessed the advantage of the home field. While the Atlanteans relied on their navy and their mercenaries, the Guardians fought for the very soil under their feet. The discipline of the Acropolis commune held against the shock of the amphibious assault. The bronze wall of the phalanx refused to break. Then, the momentum shifted. The Athenians transcended survival. They counterattacked. They drove the invaders back into the sea. And then, in a campaign that the Egyptian priests remembered with holy reverence, they pursued the retreating fleet. Athens liberated the populations of the Mediterranean within the pillars, breaking the yoke of slavery that had been placed on the neck of the world. The victory was total. The empire of the West shattered against the shield of the East. This triumph preserved the genetic and cultural continuity of the Egyptians and the Hellenes. It explains why the priests of Sais treated Solon with such respect. They viewed his ancestors as the saviors of their own civilization. But the victory parade never happened. The war had exhausted the Guardians, but the earth itself was exhausted by the conflict. The cycle of destruction described by Sonchis was due to reset. The great year had ended. The universe prepared the final corrective. The narrative now races toward its terminal velocity. The text states that, at a later time, after the war was won, there occurred portentous earthquakes and floods. The tragedy of the myth is that the Athenians saved the world, only to be erased alongside their enemies. For 2,000 years, the story of Atlantis floated in the vacuum of philosophy. It lacked a physical skeleton. Then, on March 23, 1900, an Englishman named Arthur Evans drove a spade into the soil of Crete and hit the roof of a palace. Evans had come looking for a script, evidence of a pre-Greek language. He found a civilization. Beneath the olive groves of the Kafala Hill lay the ruins of Knossos, a complex so vast and sophisticated that it forced historians to rewrite the timeline of the Mediterranean. He uncovered a culture that flourished 1,000 years before the golden age of Athens. He named them the Minoans, after the legendary king Minos. But as the dirt cleared, the forensic parallels to Plato's lost city began to accumulate. This was an empire based on an island. It was a superpower that controlled the seas. And, most importantly, it was a civilization obsessed with the bull. The architecture of Knossos presents a structural anomaly that speaks to its geopolitical status. In the ancient world, a city was defined by its walls. Babylon, Troy, Mycenae. These capitals were terrified bunkers, huddled behind massive ramparts of Cyclopean stone. But Knossos stood naked. The archaeologists found no defensive walls, no moats, no arrow slits. The palace sprawled open to the landscape, its verandas facing the sea without fear. This absence of fortification acts as a negative proof of naval supremacy. The Minoans rejected stone walls because they possessed a wooden wall, a navy so dominant that no enemy could approach the island. They lived in the hubris of peace described by Plato. The interior of the palace matched the description of Atlantean engineering. The Minoans were the master plumbers of the Bronze Age. They engineered a system of terracotta pipes that provided running water and flushing toilets to the royal apartments, a technology that would vanish from Europe for 1,500 years, 100 years after their collapse. The layout of the complex fueled the myths of later generations. Knossos contained over 1,300 rooms. It was a dense, multi-story hive of workshops, shrines, storage magazines, and royal quarters, connected by a confusing network of twisting corridors and blind staircases. To the primitive Greeks who visited this metropolis, the building seemed impossible. They lacked the architectural vocabulary to describe a multi-level administration center. So, they mythologized it. They called it the labyrinth, the house of the double axe. They imagined a monster lurking in the center. The primitive mind invented a beast, but the true monster was the empire itself. And the evidence for this connection lies painted on the plaster walls, in the single most important visual parallel between Atlantis and Crete. The stones of Knossos offered the skeleton of the empire, but the frescoes provided the soul. When Evans cleared the dust from the walls of the palace, he found images that acted as a direct visual callback to Solon's text. In Chapter 3, we describe the hunt without iron, where the Atlantean kings were required to subdue a bull using only their agility and ropes. Here, on the plaster walls of Crete, we see the physical evidence of that nightmare. The bull-leaping fresco depicts a high-stakes sport. It shows young athletes grabbing the horns of charging bulls and vaulting over their spines. This confirms the central role of the animal in the state ideology. To the Egyptians watching from afar, or hearing the stories from traders, this deadly acrobatic ritual mutated into the hunt without iron. The dance became a hunt in the telephone game of history. The convergence continues with the tribute. The Egyptian tombs of the New Kingdom, specifically the tomb of the vizier Rekhmire, depict processions of men from the islands of the Great Green. The Egyptians called them the Keftiu. These figures are painted carrying bulls' heads, golden cups, and ingots of copper and tin, the exact inventory of wealth described in the Atlantis text. However, one massive obstacle prevents the total identification of Atlantis with the Minoan Empire: the date. The priests told Solon the destruction occurred 9,000 years ago. This places the event in the Paleolithic Ice Age, 7,000 years before the construction of Knossos. This discrepancy has fueled the Lost Ice Age civilization theory for centuries. But a forensic analysis suggests a simple clerical error. The transmission of numbers between ancient languages is notoriously fragile. If one applies a factor of 10 correction, assuming that the Egyptian symbol for 100 was mistranslated as 1,000, or that lunar cycles were mistaken for solar years, the timeline snaps into focus. Reduce the date by a factor of 10. 9,000 years becomes 900 years. Solon visited Egypt around 590 BC. 900 years prior to that date lands us squarely in roughly 1500 BC. This is the golden key. This date identifies the height of the Bronze Age. It points to the exact moment the Minoan civilization vanished. It points to the eruption of Thera. The geography completes the argument. 70 miles north of Crete lies the island of Thera, known today as Santorini. Before the catastrophe, this island served as the primary naval base and religious center of the Minoan hegemony. Geologists have reconstructed the pre-eruption coastline. It was a round island. In its center stood a volcanic peak. Around the peak lay a ring of water, an ancient, flooded caldera from a previous eruption. To a sailor entering the harbor, the island presented the exact visual signature described by Plato, a central citadel surrounded by a ring of water, protecting the fleet. The Empire of the Bull functioned as a tangible maritime superpower, seated on a volcanic throne, counting down the days to the greatest explosion in human history. The apocalypse sent a courier before it arrived. The destruction of the Minoan world arrived in stages. The geological record indicates a prolonged precursor phase. Sometime in the late 17th century BC, the magma chamber beneath the island of Thera began to refill. As the molten rock pressed against the roof of the crust, it generated a specific seismic signature known as harmonic tremor. The island began to sing. A low-frequency vibration, undetectable to the ear but felt in the bone, permeated the city. The perfectly engineered drainage systems of Akrotiri began to fail. The terracotta pipes cracked. The wells, which had provided sweet water for centuries, turned bitter and yellow with dissolved sulfur. Then came the earthquake. Archaeologists excavating the site have identified a distinct seismic horizon layer below the volcanic ash. A massive tectonic shift, measuring roughly 7.0 on the Richter scale, slammed into the city. It sheared the facades off the three-story Zesta buildings. It collapsed the grand staircases. It shattered the stone pithoi jars filled with olive oil, soaking the streets in flammable liquid. The earthquake wounded the city, causing a temporary paralysis. The most heartbreaking forensic detail of Akrotiri is the evidence of the cleanup. Excavators found piles of sorted rubble. They found buckets of wet lime mortar and trowels left on top of walls. They found clear paths cleared through the debris. This data constructs a tragic narrative. After the initial earthquake, the survivors did not flee immediately. They assessed the damage. They believed the worst was over. They began to rebuild their Paris of the Bronze Age. They patched the walls and cleared the streets, unaware that the earthquake was not the main event. It was merely the throat clearing of the volcano. The rebuilding effort lasted perhaps a few weeks. Then, the chemistry of the island changed. The magma breached the water table. This contact generated phreatic explosions, steam blasts that shattered the volcanic vent. A column of grey steam began to rise from the center of the harbor. The smell of rotten eggs, hydrogen sulfide, blanketed the city. This was the final warning. The Minoans, a maritime people attuned to the moods of the earth, recognized the signal. They identified the earthquake as the prelude to a greater catastrophe. They dropped their trowels. They left the buckets of mortar drying in the sun. They initiated the evacuation protocol. The excavation of Akrotiri reveals a haunting negative space. When archaeologists dig through the layers of destruction in Pompeii, they find a cemetery. They find dogs twisted in agony, mothers shielding infants, and men crushed by falling roofs. The city captures the moment of biological death, but Akrotiri contains no ghosts. In 50 years of excavation, removing thousands of tons of volcanic pumice, workers have found tens of thousands of pots, frescoes, and tools. But they have found no human bodies. No skeletons huddle in the basements. No victims lie trapped in the streets. This absence serves as proof of a successful evacuation. The phreatic warning described in the previous subchapter gave the population a head start. The forensic profile of the ruins indicates a highly organized departure. The citizens rejected panic in favor of preparation. They packed. The inventory of the ruins confirms the logic of the refugees. The West House and the House of the Ladies contained ample supplies of grain, oil, and wine stored in massive clay pithoi. But the excavators noted a jewelry deficit. The site is virtually sterile of gold, silver, and lapis lazuli. This scarcity tells a story of rational choices made under pressure. The families of Akrotiri prioritized portable wealth. They took the gold cups, the seals, and the ceremonial blades. They left the heavy furniture and the food, expecting to return once the mountain calmed down. They locked their doors, leaving the keys in the locks, where some were found 3,000 years later, and walked to the harbor. They boarded the fleet of the Empire of the Bull. They rowed away from the smoking island, likely heading south toward the mother island of Crete, 70 miles away. They congratulated themselves on their escape. The tragedy of the Minoans is that they did everything right. They recognized the signs. They evacuated the civilians. They saved the gold. But they made one fatal calculation. They assumed the danger was confined to the land. They believed the sea offered sanctuary. They sailed directly into the kill zone. As the fleet moved south, the eruption entered its Plinian phase. The volcano ejected millions of tons of porous rock into the stratosphere. Much of this material fell back onto the ocean, creating pumice rafts, floating fields of stone up to 3 feet thick. These rafts act as maritime quicksand. They clog the oars of triremes. They grind the wooden hulls until the planks shatter. The fleet escaped the harbor only to die in the open water, immobilized by the floating stone, waiting for the pyroclastic flow to race across the waves and finish the job. The empty city remained on the island, preserved in ash. The population rests at the bottom of the Aegean. The silence of the empty city ended with the loudest sound in human history. The physics of the event defy easy comparison. When the main vent finally cleared the blockage of old rock, the pressure release launched a column of tephra into the atmosphere at supersonic speeds. This event transcended standard geology. It acted as a thermal bullet fired at the sky. Forensic volcanologists classify this as an ultraplinian eruption, rating it a 7 on the Volcanic Explosivity Index. To contextualize this scale, it possessed the explosive energy of several hundred hydrogen bombs detonating per second. The column of superheated ash, pumice, and gas rose to a height of 36 kilometers. It punched through the troposphere and entered the stratosphere, freezing instantly in the thin air. For the sailors in the fleeing fleet, Looking back over their shoulders, the horizon vanished. They saw a wall of grey matter consuming the sky. The column obeyed the description given by Pliny the Younger centuries later. It rose like the trunk of a massive tree, and then, hitting the ceiling of the atmosphere, branched outward. But this was a tree the size of a country. The darkness brought its own light. As the column rose, the friction created a secondary phenomenon. Billions of tons of pulverized rock, glass, and crystal collided within the turbulent updraft. This kinetic chaos generated a static charge of unimaginable voltage. The result was a dirty thunderstorm. The ash cloud became a battery. Bolts of red and violet lightning, colored by the chemical composition of the gases, arced continuously through the blackness. This confirms the specific details in the Atlantis text regarding fire from heaven and the flashing of the air. The sky above the Aegean became a strobe light of quiet horror, illuminating the fleeing ships in brief, terrifying snapshots. Then came the Tephra Fall. The debris ejected by the mountain began to return to Earth. It fell with the violence of hail, rejecting the gentleness of snow. Chunks of cold pumice, ranging from the size of walnuts to the size of watermelons, rained down on the open ocean. This bombardment changed the viscosity of the sea. It created the pumice rafts we analyzed in the previous chapter. The water turned into a slurry of floating stone, thickening around the hulls of the triremes, transforming the escape route into a cage. 70 miles to the south, the catastrophe arrived as a sensory assault. The citizens of Knossos, standing on the safe verandas of their palace, witnessed the death of their god. First, they saw the mushroom cloud rising over the curvature of the earth, blocking the sun. The day of darkness, described in the Egyptian records, began here. The solar disk turned a sickly, bruised purple before vanishing entirely behind the ash curtain. Then, the sound arrived. The shockwave crossed the Aegean in minutes. It hit the island of Crete with the force of a physical blow. Windows shattered, eardrums ruptured. The birds fell from the sky, their internal navigation scrambled by the pressure change. But the most dangerous element was invisible. The eruption ejected massive quantities of sulfur dioxide and fluorine gas. As the cloud drifted south, the air turned acidic. The people of Crete began to cough. They tied linen cloths around their faces, mimicking the priests of later generations, but the dust was fine enough to penetrate the weave. The empire was suffocating, but the mountain had not yet finished. The column, heavy with millions of tons of rock, could only sustain its height for so long. Eventually, gravity demanded payment. The column collapsed. Gravity eventually won the argument with the volcano. For hours, the thermal energy of the vent kept the column aloft, suspending millions of tons of rock in the stratosphere. But as the vent widened and the pressure stabilized, the density of the ash column surpassed the density of the air supporting it. The physics of the eruption inverted. The column collapsed. It rejected the wind, falling straight down, crashing back onto the island and the surrounding sea. This impact generated the most lethal phenomenon in volcanology, the pyroclastic density current. To the modern eye, this looks like a landslide of black clouds. But in forensic terms, it acts as a fluid. It is a superheated avalanche of gas, ash, and rock fragments, moving at hurricane speeds, often exceeding 300 kilometers per hour. It hugged the ground, flowing down the slopes of the caldera, erasing every tree, house, and goat path in its trajectory. It hit the coastline in seconds. The refugees on the ships believed the ocean provided a firewall. They calculated that fire cannot travel over water. They were wrong. The physics of a pyroclastic density current allow it to defy the boundary between land and sea. When the superheated mass, burning at 600 degrees Celsius, hit the Aegean, it flashed the surface water into steam instantly. This layer of high-pressure vapor acted as a hovercraft cushion. The flow refused to sink. It surfed. Friction vanished. The avalanche of gas and rock accelerated, racing across the waves on a bed of its own steam, closing the distance to the fleet in minutes. The ships were already paralyzed by the pumice rafts clogging their oars. Now, they faced the wall of heat. The arrival of the flow explains the lack of wreckage in the archaeological record. A wooden trireme hit by a pyroclastic surge does not sink intact. The kinetic force strips the masts and shatters the hull. The thermal shock incinerates the sails and boils the pitch used to waterproof the planks. The wind disassembled the fleet before the waves could swallow it. The death of the crews was a matter of biology meeting thermodynamics. The medical reality of a pyroclastic death differs from death by fire. The heat is so intense that the nerves are destroyed before they can transmit pain signals to the brain. The air itself becomes a weapon. The surge displaces the oxygen, replacing it with superheated ash and poisonous gas. The first breath burns the trachea. The second breath solidifies the lungs with a cement of wet ash. Forensic analysis of victims from similar eruptions, like Mount Pelee or Vesuvius, shows that the brain boils within the skull, causing the cranium to explode. The Minoan sailors, the finest navigators of the Bronze Age, were extinguished instantly. The flow continued past the wreck of the fleet, traveling for miles over the open ocean before finally losing its heat to the water. It left behind a sterile sea, covered in a thick grey blanket of floating stone and carbonized wood. The great power, described by Solon, had ceased to exist as a biological entity. Now, it only existed as geology. Long before the ash buried the cities, the sound buried the mind. The detonation of the magma chamber released an acoustic energy that exceeded the capacity of the atmosphere to carry it. Forensic acousticians estimate the source volume at over 300 decibels. At this level, sound ceases to be a noise. It becomes a shockwave. The air molecules were compressed into a solid wall of pressure, moving at 760 miles per hour. Any sailor within 50 miles of the vent did not hear the explosion. The pressure wave ruptured their eardrums and pulverized the alveoli in their lungs instantly. They died in absolute silence, killed by the air they tried to breathe. But for the rest of the Mediterranean, the event unfolded as a global slap. The sound wave circled the planet 4 times. It behaved according to the laws of atmospheric refraction. It bounced off the thermal layers of the upper atmosphere, skipping over certain islands only to crash down on others hundreds of miles away with undiminished force. In the Nile Delta, 500 miles to the southeast, the day began normally. Then, the ghost frequency arrived. A massive component of the eruption's energy spectrum manifested as infrasound, sound waves vibrating below 20 Hz. The human ear cannot detect these frequencies, but the human body reacts to them as a biological threat. The Egyptians felt the eruption before they heard it. The infrasound vibrated the fluid in their inner ears, causing sudden, inexplicable nausea. It resonated the globes of their eyes, blurring their vision. A collective panic gripped the city of Avaris. The scribes dropped their reeds. The priests looked to the northern horizon, where the sky was turning a bruised purple. Then, an hour later, the audible boom arrived. It sounded like the crack of a whip the size of the horizon. It shattered windows in the pharaoh's palace. The scribes recorded this anomaly. The Tempest Stele of Ahmose I describes a darkness and a great noise that threw the gods from their shrines. This acoustic trauma scarred the collective memory of the species. It was too loud to be natural, therefore it had to be theological. Centuries later, the Greek poet Hesiod wrote the Theogony, describing the war between the gods and the Titans. His description matches the forensic reality of the Thera eruption with uncanny precision. He writes of the hot vapor lapping round the Titans, of the immense flame shooting into the divine ether, and of the earth crashing with a roar that shook the chaotic void. This text serves as a black box recording of the event. The ancients mythologized the sound because they lacked the science to explain it. They called it the scream of Typhon, the father of all monsters, the storm giant buried beneath the earth, who breathes fire and speaks with the voice of 1,000 bulls. The bull imagery returns again. The sound of the volcano sounded like the bellowing of a cosmic bull, linking the geological reality back to the cultural obsession of the Minoans. The god of the sea was screaming, and he was about to deliver his final blow. The final act of the tragedy took place underground. The eruption had evacuated 60 cubic kilometers of molten rock from the belly of the earth. This expulsion created a massive structural deficit. The magma chamber, which had supported the weight of the island for millennia, now stood empty. It became a vacuum the size of a mountain range. Gravity demanded a correction. The roof of the chamber, the limestone bedrock, the cities, the ports, and the mountains fractured. In a single geological heartbeat, the center of the island detached from the perimeter. It dropped like a piston into a cylinder. This event marks the literal moment of the disappearance described by Plato. The city did not slowly sink beneath the waves due to rising sea levels. It fell into a hole. One moment, the citadel stood 300 meters above sea level. The next, it sat 400 meters below it. The round island shattered, leaving behind only the jagged crescent-shaped rim known today as Santorini. The collapse triggered a secondary violent reaction, the quenching. The Atlantic Ocean, or rather the Aegean, rushed in to fill the void. Billions of gallons of seawater poured over the fractured rim of the caldera, cascading down onto the superheated floor of the collapsed volcano. Thermodynamics dictates that water expands 1,600 times when converted to steam. The interaction between the cold sea and the red-hot rock turned the caldera into a pressurized boiler. The ocean boiled. Geysers of scalding mud and steam shot kilometers into the air, mixing with the falling ash to create a thick, viscous slurry. This brings us to the most specific and confusing detail in Solon's text. Plato writes that after the destruction, the ocean became impassable and impenetrable because of a shoal of mud left by the sinking island. For centuries, skeptics argued that a sunken island would leave deep water, not a mud bank. The Geology vindicates the text. The mud, described by the priests, consisted of a matrix of floating pumice. When a volcano collapses into the sea, it generates a pumice raft that can remain buoyant for years. Historical records from the Krakatoa eruption confirm that ships were blocked by floating stone banks up to 5 meters thick. The impassable barrier was real. The Atlantean archipelago vanished, replaced by a grey, shifting wasteland of floating rock that denied entry to any ship attempting to salvage the ruins. The empire was buried under a lid of stone, sealing the tomb for 3,000 years. But the water that rushed into the hole had to go somewhere. It rebounded. The energy of the collapse transferred to the ocean, generating a pulse of kinetic energy that turned outward, aiming for the coasts of the Mediterranean. The fire was over. The water was coming. The collapse of the island transformed the potential energy of the rock into the kinetic energy of the sea. When the caldera floor dropped, it displaced roughly 60 cubic kilometers of seawater. This massive volume of fluid rushed into the superheated pit, rebounded against the boiling rock, and ejected outward. This generated a specific hydraulic phenomenon known as a soliton. Unlike a wind-driven wave, which affects only the surface, a soliton moves the entire column of water from the surface to the seabed. It functions as a wall of energy traveling through the ocean at the speed of a jet aircraft, roughly 800 kilometers per hour. The wave radiated outward in a perfect circle. To the west, it struck the Peloponnese. To the east, it hammered the coast of Turkey. But the primary target lay to the south. The wave drew a straight line toward the heart of the Minoan civilization, the north coast of Crete. The arrival of the tsunami began with a deception. Before the crest of the wave hits, the trough arrives. The ocean draws in a deep breath. At the harbor of Amnisos, the port serving the palace of Knossos, the sea suddenly drained away. The water receded from the coastline, exposing the sea floor for hundreds of meters. Minoan sailors, standing on the docks, witnessed their ships suddenly drop and settle onto the mud. Fish flapped on the naked sand. The silence of the vanished ocean replaced the noise of the surf. This phenomenon, known as the drawback, serves as a fatal curiosity. It lures the ignorant onto the exposed beach just minutes before the impact. Then, the horizon elevated. The white line in the distance grew into a mountain of water. Estimates based on sediment deposits suggest the wave reached a height of 30 to 50 meters by the time it entered the shallows of the Cretan coast. The impact broke the back of the empire. The water struck the north coast of Crete with the force of a tectonic hammer. It pulverized the ports of Amnisos, Malea, and Gornia. The Minoan navy, the wooden wall that had rendered defensive fortifications obsolete, ceased to exist. The ships stranded by the drawback were lifted, smashed against the cliffs, or dragged inland and deposited in olive groves kilometers from the shore. But the forensic signature of the event lies in the retreat. The Villa of the Lilies at Amnisos provides the smoking gun. Archaeologists found massive ashlar blocks from the walls displaced outward toward the sea. This indicates the power of the backwash. As the megatonnage of water retreated to the ocean, it acted as a vacuum cleaner. It scoured the coastline down to the bedrock, dragging the ruins of the cities into the deep. The wave stripped the island of its fleet, its harbors, and its sense of invincibility. The Minoans survived the earthquake. They survived the ash, but they could not survive the loss of the sea. The water retreated, but the darkness remained. The eruption of Thera ejected 40 cubic kilometers of rock into the sky, but it also released millions of tons of sulfur dioxide aerosols. These particles formed a sulfuric acid veil in the stratosphere, reflecting solar radiation back into space. The result was a volcanic winter that strangled the growing season of the Bronze Age. The evidence for this climate collapse exists in the biological hard drive of the planet. Dendrochronologists analyzing ancient oak trees preserved in Irish bogs identified a catastrophic growth event, a narrow frost ring, dating to the late 17th century BC. The trees effectively went into hibernation. They recorded a year where the summer failed to arrive. This atmospheric anomaly extended to the far side of the globe. The Bamboo Annals, the ancient chronicles of China, record bizarre weather phenomena during the final years of the Xia dynasty. They describe yellow fogs, frost in July, and the dimming of the sun. The empire of the bull died locally, but its funeral shroud wrapped the entire earth. In the Aegean, the climate crisis triggered a geopolitical collapse. The Minoan civilization survived the physical trauma of the eruption, but the tsunami had stripped them of their navy. The wooden wall was gone. The island of Crete lay defenseless, its ports ruined, and its fields covered in saline ash. This vulnerability invited the predator. The Mycenaeans, the warrior culture from the Greek mainland, the historical ancestors of Solon's Athenians, seized the opportunity. The archaeological record at Knossos shows a sudden, violent transition. Around 1450 BC, the Minoan script, Linear A, vanishes, replaced instantly by the Mycenaean script, Linear B. This transition provides the historical seed for Plato's war. In the myth, Athens defeats Atlantis in battle. In reality, the mainlanders occupied the vacuum left by the volcano. They conquered a ghost. They took the throne of Knossos, appropriated the myths of the bull and the labyrinth, and ruled over the ruins of the Golden Age. The Bronze Age eventually recovered, but the memory of the catastrophe festered. The Egyptians recorded the terror in the Tempest Stele and the Ipuwer Papyrus, speaking of a river that turned to blood, red volcanic ash, and a land shrouded in darkness. The Greeks encoded it into the Titanomachy and the myth of Phaeton, the sun chariot that scorched the earth. Over the centuries, the specific details faded. The location of Thera was forgotten. The name of the Keftiu was lost. All that remained was a vague, terrifying racial memory of a great island empire that angered the gods, fought a war with the Greeks, and vanished in a single day and night of fire and water. The reality became a story. The story became a myth. And 2,000 years later, the myth landed on the desk of a philosopher named Plato, who used it to teach a lesson about the corruption of power. The world had ended. The dream was about to begin. For 1,500 years, the city of Atlantis existed only as a footnote. The silence was enforced by the highest authority in Western thought, Aristotle. Plato's most famous student dismissed the account of his teacher with a lethal brevity. Strabo records his verdict: "He who created it also destroyed it." Aristotle categorized Atlantis as a noble lie, a philosophical thought experiment designed to illustrate the ideal state rather than a geographical reality. Because the medieval church venerated Aristotle as the philosopher, his skepticism became dogma. European intellectuals treated Atlantis as a fable, akin to Aesop's talking animals. Maps of the Middle Ages, the Mappa Mundi, depicted the Atlantic Ocean as a void, the Mare Tenebrosum, or Sea of Darkness. Then, the void produced a continent. The voyage of 1492 shattered the Aristotelian seal. The discovery of the Americas presented a theological crisis. Here was a massive landmass populated by millions of people who were not mentioned in the Bible. To explain their existence, European intellectuals reached back to Plato. Historians like Francisco López de Gomara argued that the Americas were the island of Atlantis, or at least its survivors. They pointed to the pyramids of Mexico and the sun worship of the Incas as evidence of a shared lineage with Egypt. The noble lie became the New World. This period birthed the first attempts to map the lost island scientifically. In 1664, the Jesuit polymath Athanasius Kircher published Mundus Subterraneus. He included a map of Atlantis, situated between Spain and America. This map contains a famous cartographic quirk. It is oriented upside down, with south at the top, honoring the Egyptian perspective. It marks the transition of Atlantis from a ghost story to a navigational problem. But the true mutation of the myth occurred in England. In 1627, Francis Bacon published New Atlantis. He appropriated the name to envision a future utopia, discarding the tragic past. His Ben Salem was a society ruled by scientists rather than priests, dedicated to the enlarging of the bounds of human empire. Bacon planted a seed that would bloom 2 centuries later. He associated the name Atlantis with advanced technology and secret knowledge. He stripped the mud and the tragedy from the story, leaving only the glamour of the super civilization. The stage was set for the man who would turn this glamour into a religion. In 1882, a failed politician from Minnesota published a book that became the Bible of the alternative historian. Ignatius Donnelly was a man of manic intellect, a former lieutenant governor, a utopian novelist, and a catastrophic scholar. His book, Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, accomplished something that 2,000 years of philosophy had failed to do. It moved Atlantis from the fiction section to the science section. Donnelly operated as a forensic prosecutor for the defense of the myth. He rejected the Aristotelian idea of allegory. He argued that Plato's account functioned as literal history. To prove this, he constructed a grand unified theory of civilization known as diffusionism. He looked at the world and saw impossible coincidences. He saw pyramids in Egypt and pyramids in Mexico. He saw mummification in the Nile Valley and mummification in Peru. He saw the arch in Rome and the arch in the Yucatan. The academic consensus of his day attributed these parallels to independent invention. Donnelly rejected this. He posited a common parent civilization, a central source from which all human culture radiated. Donnelly armored his theories with the latest Victorian science. He seized upon the data returned by the HMS Challenger, the first ship to map the depths of the Atlantic. The Challenger soundings revealed a massive, submerged mountain range running north to south through the ocean, the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. Modern geologists recognize this as the seam where tectonic plates pull apart. Donnelly identified it as a corpse. He named it Dolphin Ridge and claimed it was the sunken backbone of the lost continent. He argued that the peaks of the Azores were the mountaintops of Atlantis, the last visible remnants of the empire. This fusion of oceanography and mythology proved intoxicating. It provided a scientific location for the Garden of Eden. Donnelly synthesized the flood myths of the world, from the Book of Genesis to the Epic of Gilgamesh to the legends of the Ojibwe. He synthesized these religious traditions into a single witness testimony. The impact of Donnelly's work shaped every subsequent iteration of the legend. Before Donnelly, Atlantis was a parable about corruption. After Donnelly, Atlantis became the mother culture. He argued that the gods of the Greeks, the Phoenicians, and the Norse were confused memories of the Atlantean kings and queens. Zeus, Odin, and Osiris were merely refugees, civilizing the savages of the post-flood world. This narrative shift planted the seed for the high-tech Atlantis theories of the 20th century. By defining Atlantis as the source of all knowledge, Donnelly implicitly defined it as superior to the modern world. He created a psychological longing for a lost perfection. The book became a global bestseller. It convinced Prime Minister Gladstone to propose a Royal Navy expedition to find the city. It failed to find the city, but it succeeded in resurrecting the dream. The search for Atlantis moved from the library to the field, and in the modern era, that search fixated on a bizarre geological formation in the Sahara Desert. In the 21st century, the search for Atlantis migrated from the library to Google Earth. The shift began in navigation orbit. During the Gemini missions of the 1960s, astronauts scanning the Sahara for impact craters reported a massive geological anomaly in the Adrar Plateau of Mauritania. They called it the Guelb Er Rishat, the Rishat structure. To the internet generation, it became known as the Eye of Africa. For decades, geologists classified it as a curiosity. But to the forensic investigator of the Atlantis text, the structure presents a visual match so precise it triggers the phenomenon of pareidolia, the mind's obsession with recognizing patterns. The eye represents the strongest prosecution case for a terrestrial Atlantis ever mounted. The argument rests on three pillars: geometry, geography, and geology. The visual correlation is absolute. Plato describes a city of alternating rings of water and land. The Rishat structure consists of deeply eroded concentric ridges of igneous rock and sedimentary valleys. From the air, the correspondence to Solon's bullseye map creates a sense of uncanny recognition. It looks exactly like the schematic Solon drew in the dust of Sais. The second pillar is the mathematics of the diameter. Coincidences in nature are common, but coincidences in scale are rare. Solon's text provides a specific measurement for the outer limit of the city, 127 stadia. Converting ancient units requires choosing between the Attic stadium, 185 meters, and the Egyptian stadium, 157 meters. However, if one applies the standard conversion used in academic history, the diameter of Plato's city comes to roughly 23.5 kilometers. The rigid outer circle of the Rishat structure measures roughly 23.5 kilometers. This precise synchronization of scale drives the modern obsession with the site. The probability of a natural geological formation sharing both the exact shape and the exact dimensions of a mythical city seems statistically negligible. The theory argues that Plato recorded the dimensions of the Rishat from reality, rejecting the idea of invention. The third pillar addresses the environment. Critics point out the obvious flaw. Atlantis was an island in the ocean, while the Rishat is a rock formation in one of the driest deserts on Earth. But the climate record offers a rebuttal. Forensic climatology confirms that during the African humid period, which ended roughly 5,000 years ago, the Sahara functioned as a lush savanna, crisscrossed by massive river systems. Radar topography has identified the ghost of the Tamanrasset River, a massive waterway that once flowed from the Atlas Mountains, past the Rishat and into the Atlantic. The theory suggests that during high water levels, the Rishat stood as an island fortress within this estuarine system, accessible to the sea yet protected inland. The surrounding geography also aligns with the text. Plato mentions mountains to the north protected the city from the wind. The Adrar Plateau rises directly to the north of the Rishat. He mentions the stone was black, white, and red. The geological survey of the Rishat confirms the presence of black basalt, white limestone, and red iron-rich sandstone. He mentions the ground was salty. The valleys of the Rishat are encrusted with sebkas, salt flats left by receding waters. The prosecution rests its case on the accumulation of these details. To the believer, the Eye of Africa is the corpse of the city, stripped of its flesh by thousands of years of wind and sand, leaving only the skeletal geometry behind. The visual match is seductive, but the geology is lethal. To the eye of the satellite, the Rishat looks like a ruined fortress. But to the hammer of the geologist, it looks like a deeply eroded domal anticline. The formation is a scar. The structure formed roughly 100 million years ago, during the Cretaceous period, long before the evolution of primates. A plume of magma rose from the mantle, pushing the sedimentary layers of the crust upward, creating a massive geological pimple. Crucially, the magma failed to breach the surface. It cooled underground. The concentric canals that captivate the internet are actually artifacts of differential erosion. The dome consisted of alternating layers of hard crystalline rock and soft sedimentary rock. Over millions of years, the wind acted as a lathe. It stripped away the soft rock, creating valleys, while the hard rock remained as ridges. The walls of the city are simply the ribs of the earth, exposed by time. The theory suffers a second, fatal blow from the altimeter. Plato explicitly describes Atlantis as a seaport, accessible from the ocean by ships. He describes the sea levels interacting with the city rings. However, the Richat structure sits on the Adrar Plateau at an elevation of roughly 400 meters, over 1,300 feet, above current sea level. For the Atlantic Ocean to flow into the Richat, the global sea level would need to rise by 400 meters. This hydrological scenario creates a paradox. A sea level rise of that magnitude would drown the entire continent of Europe, the Amazon basin, and the Nile Valley. If the Richat was Atlantis, then the rest of the ancient world lived underwater. Proponents argue that the land might have uplifted tectonically. While geological uplift occurs, the speed required to lift a city 400 meters in a few thousand years violates the standard rates of plate tectonics. The Richat has sat high and dry for eons. Finally, we must consult the dirt itself. If the Richat was the capital of a Bronze Age superpower, it would contain the debris of occupation, millions of pottery shards, foundation stones, metallic slag, and graves. Archaeologists have surveyed the site. They found artifacts, but they found the wrong timeline. The surface of the Richat is scattered with Acheulean hand axes and Neolithic arrowheads. These tools prove that humans lived here, but they identify the residents as Paleolithic hunter-gatherers and Neolithic nomads. The site suffers from a total absence of urbanization. There are no port structures. There are no quarries. The red, black, and white stone is there, but it is uncut. There is no buried gold. The silence of the archaeological record is absolute. The Eye of Africa is a natural wonder that humans visited, but never built. The prosecution relied on the view from space. The defense relied on the view from the ground. The verdict is clear. The Richat is a geological coincidence, a masterpiece of pareidolia. To find the true Atlantis, we must look away from the salt flats and return to the synthesis of the data. While the geologists scanned the desert, the mystics scanned the ocean. The search for Atlantis in the Caribbean relies less on Plato and more on a trance state. In 1940, the American psychic Edgar Cayce, known as the Sleeping Prophet, issued a specific forecast. He declared that the western edge of Atlantis, a region he called Poseidia, would rise from the sea in the years 1968 or 1969. History offered a rare synchronization. In September 1968, precisely within the window of the prophecy, a diver named J. Manson Valentine spotted an anomaly off the coast of North Bimini in the Bahamas. In roughly 20 feet of water, he found a structure that appeared to be a paved road. The Bimini Road consists of a half-mile array of limestone blocks, roughly rectangular, arranged in a linear formation. To the believer, this was the vindication of the psychic method. The stones looked cut, They lay in straight lines, and they appeared exactly when and where the prophet said they would. However, the geology of the Bahamas offers a mundane explanation for the miracle. Marine geologists identify the stones as beach rock, a sedimentary concrete that forms rapidly beneath the sand in tropical waters. The supposed paving stones display the classic signature of orthogonal fracturing. When a large slab of beach rock is undermined by erosion, it settles. The stress causes it to snap in straight lines and right angles, creating a tessellated pavement effect. Nature, in this case, behaves like a mason. The road points to a geological process, leading nowhere but the seabed. Yet the ambiguity remains. Carbon dating of shells embedded in the stones yields dates ranging from 2000 BC to recent history, muddying the timeline. And the formation describes a distinct J shape, a geometry often used in ancient harbour construction to break the swell of the waves. The Bimini Road sits on the threshold of proof, too regular to be easily dismissed, yet too natural to be definitively claimed. The final frontier of the search lies at the bottom of the world. In 1958, an academic named Charles Hapgood proposed a radical solution to the Atlantis problem. He argued that the lost continent relocated, rejecting the sinking hypothesis. Hapgood developed the theory of Earth crust displacement. He posited that the lithosphere, the rigid outer shell of the planet, can occasionally slip over the semi-fluid inner mantle, much like the skin of a loose orange rotating around the fruit. In this model, a continent positioned in a temperate, habitable zone can be physically slid into the polar circle in a geological instant. The theory gained a formidable patron, Albert Einstein. The physicist wrote the foreword to Hapgood's book, validating the mathematical possibility of the mechanism. But the forensic evidence for the theory came from a library in Istanbul. The map drawn by the Ottoman admiral Piri Reis in 1513 contains a baffling anomaly. The bottom edge of the chart depicts a coastline that corresponds to Queen Maud Land in Antarctica. However, the map depicts this coast free of ice. It shows rivers, mountain ranges, and shallow bays. Hapgood's interpretation of the map creates a chilling narrative for the end of the Golden Age. He compared the Admiral's map to the seismic surveys conducted by the Swedish-British expedition of 1949. The survey utilized sonar to map the bedrock beneath the mile-thick ice sheet. Hapgood argued that the topography of the bedrock matched the topography of the 1513 map. This correlation suggests a specific sequence of events. It implies that the Atlanteans mapped their homeland while it sat in a temperate latitude. Then, the crust shifted. The continent slid south. The temperate climate vanished, replaced by the polar vortex. In this version of the myth, Atlantis was destroyed by ice. The city sits preserved today beneath 2 miles of glacial pressure, a flash-frozen time capsule waiting for the drill. The White Island theory completes the circuit of the elements: Earth, Santorini, water, tsunami, and finally, ice. The search for Atlantis ends where it began, in the human mind. We have scoured the ocean floor with sonar. We have drilled into the ice of Antarctica. We have analyzed the satellite topography of the Sahara. Yet the city refuses to surrender its coordinates. This evasion suggests that the location of Atlantis matters less than its function. The myth endures through its psychology, transcending its geology. It serves as the secular version of the Garden of Eden. It provides a physical address for the universal human feeling of loss, the haunting suspicion that we are the degenerate descendants of a greater race. Plato designed the story as a warning rather than a guidebook. He constructed a civilization that perfected the material world, mastering engineering, genetics, and energy, only to lose its soul. He held up a mirror to the Athens of his day, a city drunk on naval power and commerce. Today, the mirror reflects a different empire. We see ourselves in the concentric rings. We recognize the society that builds walls of glass and steel, that mines the earth for rare metals to power its networks, and that believes its technology offers immunity from the laws of nature. We share the hubris of the kings who sat in the azure robes. The power of Atlantis lies in its absence. If we found the ruins tomorrow, if we dredged up the golden statues and placed them in a museum, the magic would evaporate. It would become just another pile of dead stone, like Babylon or Troy. By remaining lost, it remains perfect. It survives as the eternal what if, a phantom limb of the human imagination that aches whenever we look at the sea. The island sleeps in the dark, waiting for the wheel of the great year to turn, waiting for the moment when the water rises again to claim the works of man.